As I was briefly explaining before, even before this week, when I was looking ahead at the various lessons, even though I tried to get out of teaching this lesson, I was getting intrigued about certain methodology in presenting this story of Jonah. And it led me on my own search. And those of you who know me know that I have a bit of a historical bent. And so it led me on a search to see if I could find what's going on as far as the story of Jonah in the context of history. So I've been looking at a lot of historical accounts, our commentaries, our dictionaries, internet. And by the way, it was so interesting to see articles appearing on the internet and full essays that had been written by the evangelical focus in Europe and quoting F.D. Nicol, out of the SDA Bible commentary, etc. I thought, gee, that's interesting that, that he has such a wide recognition in so many circles. So that's just a little aside. But anyway, so here is what I've found. And I decided that for the first 15 minutes, I would like to just quickly run through what I've put together here, because by the end of the week, I finally felt comfortable enough to present this. Initially I didn't. I thought, no, it's too damning. It's going to hurt somebody. If you can't solve it yourself, why should you do it? So it's about Jonah, and the story of Jonah obviously involves the city of Nineveh. And it's really that connection, and here we go. Right, so you see here, there are three cities. Asher was a capital city of Nineveh. All right? A capital city of Assyria. Let's get our statements right here. And we're talking the Neo-Assyrian, as you'll see on the timeline in a minute. It's the Neo, or the early, the latter period of the Assyrian history. And then they moved, the next city they went to, Kala, which was more commonly known today as Nimrud, R-U-D, not Nimrod. Nimrod probably founded all this, if you look at Genesis. But then finally they moved up to Nineveh. And Nineveh is just above there in the, there it is. There's Nineveh. They are the three capital cities that were used during the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Right, let's move on. Nineveh today is on the east side of the Tigris-Euphrates, as you saw in that last picture there in the Mesopotamian Valley. And the actual city itself, there are ruins, there are remnants of the past, as you see, part of the old wall there where the towers are still visible. There are reconstructions, some of the gates have been reconstructed, etc. And there's lots of dig sites. That's what you see if you go to Nineveh today. Whoops, too fast, just go one at a time. But what, this disturbed me. 2007, ISIS took bulldozers, as you can see here, and they pushed over a lot of these monuments that have been standing for centuries, some of them reconstructed in recent times. They bulldozed them because they were too much of an evidence of what they weren't supporting. All right? And so a lot of what used to be in Nineveh and available for the tourists to see today is just another pile of rubble again, which is just imagine if Henry Layard, who was the great archaeologist in the middle of the 1800s, when he went there and did the excavation in Nineveh, he found phenomenal stuff. And if he saw what's happened here, he'd cry, I'm sure. Okay, so here's our timeline, our first timeline, and this is the basis of the timelines that will follow. The yellow is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the New Assyrian Empire. It had kind of, while the actual empire it had arisen about 1,500 years before this time, was the beginning of the Assyrian powers and emperors, and they even trace back their kings, etc., going back hundreds of years. But the Neo-Assyrian Empire began in 933 BC. That's just 2 years before let's start off with Saul, David and Solomon's united kingdom of Israel, divided into the north, the kingdom of Israel, and then carried off into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. And of course, in the south, there was Judah that was carried into Babylonian captivity in 587. And it's interesting to notice that the Neo-Assyrian Empire just lays over the top of that divided kingdom very, very neatly for its start and its finish, because in 612 BC, the Babylonians, who'd had enough of the Assyrians, joined with the power of the Medes, utterly annihilated, better than even ISIS has done with their bulldozers in recent times. They annihilated Nineveh, and it never really got ever rebuilt again since that date. And 2 or 3 years after that, the empire totally was non-existent, and Babylonia became the great empire. So that's a basis. Now, what I've done, I've moved them down to the bottom of the screen because I want to keep putting stuff in the top. And you can see I've already popped Jonah in, so you get the context of where Jonah is in terms of Israel, and we'll get more detail of that later, and how he's going to correspond to what's in Assyria. All right, now, here's what I want to say. Every internet source I could find said that the capital cities in the Neo-Assyrian Empire were 3. There was Ashur, and in 1879, Ashurbanipal II, he switched across to Nimrud, or Calah as it was called in the Old Testament. He switched to Calah and established that as the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And you see that lasted right down to the beginning of 705. That was Sennacherib. And he shifted it again because he didn't want to have anything to do with his father was king. So we'll have a new palace completely down there up there at Nineveh. Okay? Jonah comes in the middle of that second city, Nimrud. When he went to Nineveh, it was not the capital. All right? And that was one of my dilemmas. Well, hang on, I thought the king, the palace, what's going on here? And I eventually solved it. Now, the other thing that's interesting to notice is again, the sites tend to divide this Assyrian Empire into 3 sections. Beginning in 933, there was the ascension of the Neo-Assyrian power in a very rapid way, with several leaders that quickly rose up. Then there was a decline, and then by the time we get to 824 BC, so we're now almost getting 1/3 into the time of Israel, but nearly half actually, there was a complete weakening of Assyria. For example, Jeroboam, who was the king of Jonah's time, he is the longest ruling Israelite king, and he's the most powerful of the Israelite kings, and it probably happened in the vacuum that was happening in Assyria at that time. All right? So hold on to that piece of information. It'll become relevant later. And then, almost at the same time as Assyria takes Israel off into captivity, we have the story of Sennacherib. He comes to, well, actually, a little before, in 745, as you'll see, there were 2 kings in there first, and then in 705. And this is described by the sites as being Assyria's most powerful period. This is when the empire was at its strongest, going right back to the origins, 2,500 years or 2,000 years earlier. All right? So that just gives you a couple of generalized statements. Now, here's what I've done. The red circle, and I'm finding that the mouse wasn't working as quickly as I wanted it to, but you can see the red circle there in the middle. The red circle now, I've actually taken the period that corresponds to this. This is the period of 80 years of weakness in the Assyrian Empire, and I've exploded it out to take up that full brownish section above there, all right? So you can see that starts from 824 and going right down to 745, and you can see the various kings of Assyria during that time. Now, I found almost nothing on 4 of them, but I found quite a bit on Adad Nara-Arai. Now, I hope I got the pronunciation right. I've actually never come across this name before, so it may be wrong. And he became the pharaoh at the time, was probably the strongest out of the 5 of those during that period. And he is also going to be, as we'll see, the king, not the pharaoh, the king of Jonah's time. All right? Right. Now, I'm going to move from that. I'll come back to it at the end and deal with a couple of things dealing with Adonirari. But before I get there, what I want to do now is I'm going to shoot up to the last period of the Assyrians. So the red circle now is going around the last period, which is where we get into Assyria's greatest era. Sennacherib. And I've exploded that out. And you can see the different kings there going right down to 622 in the blue patch at the top. I will quickly mention some of these people by name. And maybe I should open my notes just in case I get to the stage where I need a little help here with this. But let's start. Our pamphlet, after talking about Jonah, in the time of King Jeroboam, it jumped straight into describing the greatness of Assyria from Sennacherib's time. And it did it fairly, because go to the SDA commentary, it does the same thing. And I immediately had hackles raised. Why can you describe the greatness of Syria from a time that's 100 years yet future? Why don't we talk about the greatness of Assyria at that time and earlier? But it's totally ignored. And so I started searching, looking for evidence, etc. And look, just to let you appreciate that they're on the right track, it was a great time. And I guess you can say some of the principles that may have been the reason why Jonah went, I'm not going to Nineveh. The principles of how the Assyrian people thought and acted may have been seen in the earlier times or what was seen in later times. But you just, for example, very quickly for a moment, let me just identify these one at a time. Tiglath-Pileser III, he's the first one there on the line. You can see him, all right. He was the one who started to really strengthen, he pushed the borders out. And he really got things moving again as far as Assyria is concerned after those weak kings. For example, one of the things he did was that he put Babylon back in their place, who were arising, and he made himself the king of Babylon. So he is actually listed, Tiglath-Pileser III is listed as one of the early kings of Babylon. All right? And it shows you that he really started getting things moving in that regard. He reclaims a lot of territory, and he continues. And by the way, he wasn't called Tiglath-Pileser in Babylon, he's called Pul. And you might find that name in the Bible, just P-U-L. Then Shalmaneser the fifth, he followed and tried to do the same thing, but he was there for a very short period of time. And then you will notice what happens to him is that this is at the time now, 722, you will notice that he actually dies the same year that the next king is going to take Israel off into captivity. But he started showing his strength. He actually held a siege around Samaria for 3 years. Hey, this is sounding a bit familiar, but it's on the other foot. Anyway, so he holds a siege around Samaria. No one could come in or out. Tried to starve them to death. No water. And so, although they did have a good water supply. And so, yeah, this was interesting. And then he dies, and then Sargon II comes in, and he does break through, and he sends all the Assyrians out, all the Israelite people of Samaria, all over the Assyrian kingdom, all over the place, scattered them. They didn't just go to one place; they were scattered. And these people picked up here, and they were put back into the territory of Israel, and put some of those in there, some from there, and he kept swapping and mixing them all up because he thought that was the best way to weaken them. But in another way, it strengthened them. But anyway, that was it certainly did weaken them as a nation. And then after Sargon II, we come to Sennacherib. And look, Sennacherib he is regarded as the greatest of the Assyrian kings. And you've only got to read, and of course, by this stage, Israel has gone in Sennacherib's time, but he's very much around in Judah's time. And consequently, Sennacherib, you remember, twice came to Jerusalem. Once he went down south to the little town a little bit further down from Jerusalem, which is called, it's just escaped me for a minute. Don't worry, it's not important just now. Lachish. And he destroyed Lachish, never captured Jerusalem. He besieged it, but he never broke into it. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute from him that was important. And so Sennacherib was a great person. Let me just, for example, show you. Henry Layard was the archaeologist who in the middle of the 1800s came and dug up this part of Nineveh. Remember now, Sennacherib didn't like where his father was king, so he's going to make a new kingdom, as it were, a new palace. So he builds a new palace, and this is no mean palace. It was nearly 200 metres by 200 metres in size. It had 80 rooms in the palace, and he extended the borders. He doubled the territory of Nineveh in his period of his reign, so that territory now covered a collection. I've just got 1,800 acres. It was one of the largest, if not the largest city in the world, but it was on basically a flat plain. There wasn't a lot of multi-stories as we might have today to make some cities much, much larger, of course. So this is Sennacherib. Let's have a look, for example. This is one of his rooms of the 80, and it's Henry Layard. He wrote descriptions from the discoveries he made in his archaeological diggings, and artists have tried to picture what he has described. And this is how they saw one of the rooms in his palace, just one of 80. On the palace walls, there were reliefs of the victories, and you can see this here. This is actually picturing the victory at Lachish. And here we see something very interesting. You can see that the captives are impaled with sharp poles. They're flailing, skinned alive was a part of the process. This is giving you a bit of an idea, perhaps, why did Jonah balk going to Assyria? These people were very cruel, and Sennacherib certainly demonstrated that.
Weren't you saying that Sennacherib lived after?
Yes, I'm coming to all that. But as I said, in hindsight, we're seeing that, okay, the same characteristics must have been there before, but he certainly lived after. We must recognise that. Here's a gate of ancient Nineveh that has been restored, and Henry Layard found all these winged bulls, human-headed winged bulls, all over the city, and they're all through the various museums of the world today, mostly London. And they found also this prism of Sennacherib, sometimes called Hezekiah's prism because it's got Hezekiah's name on. And Sennacherib, this is how he described a siege of Jerusalem that failed, because remember how the angel of the Lord came in and caused the failure. But of course you don't record that in your records like Sennacherib's records. He said, and here are his actual words, I locked Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. That's how he described the siege. But he doesn't say how he was defeated himself and had to flee for his life. All right, and then of course after Sennacherib there's Eshhun. He didn't like Sennacherib's palace, so he built another one in Nineveh. And then we have Ashurbanipal, and I'll just pause for a moment on Ashurbanipal. And Ashurbanipal it's described, the kingdom of Assyria during Ashurbanipal's time was probably the height of Assyria. But notice what happens. One of the things that Ashurbanipal did that is just so much appreciated today, he had this huge library of 30,000 clay tablets. Some of them are on display in the museum at the British Museum, but most of them are in the back rooms and cupboards. Some of them aren't even read yet. So there's a lot of work there to go. Two of the famous ones, not only found here but in other sites as well, Enuma Elish, that was the one that had the creation story. And the Epical Gilgamesh was the one that had the flood story. And of course, as Christians, we see, while the stories are not the same as the biblical one, there are echoes, and we see that there must have been some common interest there between those two accounts. So that's Ashurbanipal, and of course, after him, there are 3 weak kings, and then Assyria is destroyed. Amazing, from that amazing height, so quickly destroyed. It should have been an example to Babylon that followed afterward in a very, very similar vein. All right, so what we've seen now then is that we've seen the period after Jonah. And boy, I could understand anybody saying, no, I'm not going to Nineveh. in Jonah's time. It was the capital city, it was the palace, and there were kings like we have described that were absolutely brutal, and it was a sad record of human history at that stage. But now what I want to do is say, okay, then there's got to be something about the early kings that made Jonah stop and think as well. So let me just have a quick look here, and we have to do this fairly quickly. For example, look, all of these individuals during this period made some contribution to the history, but not as much as perhaps was made in later years. The one that I would like to pick up is Shalmaneser III. It shows him paying tribute to, it shows Jehu, the Israelite king, paying tribute to Shalmaneser. And on another one of the panels, it actually tells how much tribute he had to bring, as well as bowing in homage here. All right? So this gives you an idea that before the time of Jonah, they had seen again and again and again atrocities happening that originated from Assyria coming to the people. In fact, altogether in Assyrian history, there are 6 of the Israelite kings that are mentioned in the Assyrian history. There are many of the Assyrian kings mentioned in the biblical history, and it's a constant record of the struggle that was going on between them. So you can see the struggle that was found there between Jonah's thinking and what the past was like. And I just wanted to... here's a statement that came from Assyrian records. It says their intention was to create streams of blood that would be shed, and corpses would be piled up as high as a mountain to their enemies. They're not particularly pleasant folk. And look, you may be thinking of some current situations that could parallel these stories, and that would be justified as well. Ahab, of course, you probably remember the story of Ahab, who joined Syria against Shalmaneser with his 2,000 chariots and his 10,000 footmen, but just about wiped out by Assyria. So Jonah did have something to be a little fearful of. So now I want to bring you back to the time of this man, Adadad Nirari, I think he may be pronounced. I might just shorten him for Adadad for the time being. He was the one who was around, and I'll go to, and there's a relief of him from his time. And by the way, I found out that pointed finger, and you see it a lot in the Assyrian statues or monuments, stones, reliefs, etc. That pointed finger would be probably about the equivalent of the Christian putting their hands up to pray. It was a homage sign to the gods, and usually at the time it signified that they were praying to their God. And then they had their various record of history, etc. Okay, so here we've got, and now I have blown up, you can see now that Adonirari, I've blown up, he's taken almost that full column of Assyria, and I've blown up Israel likewise there, and you can see that they've taken up that period of time as well. Now, what we find is this, whoops, go to there. In 2 Kings, referred to in our pamphlet, that Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel, became king of Israel in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoke through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath. All right? And then we notice that while that is in Jeroboam's time, that the same description is given for Jonah in Jonah 1:1. So he is the same Jonah that you've got in Jeroboam that I believe is mentioned in Jonah 1. Of course, a lot of critics say, no, it's a different Jonah, and they will take the story right up past the time of Sennacherib, etc. All right, but I'm going to keep him there in the time when I think the Bible puts him, and that is in the time of Jeroboam. So if we look now, that Jonah, and you can see now the rule of Jonah, the first about decade of Jonah's rulership, he was in a joint relationship with his father, and eventually his father dies in 782 and he becomes the ruler in his full right. And as you can see, he lasted from 1793 when he started till 753, about 40 years, the longest ruling king in Israel. He was a very strong king. And he did a lot. And Jonah appears in that time. And the estimates are done, and I have not found the arguments to support this, so again, I just give it to you as it is. The estimates say that it was probably around, about 790, maybe into the 788, 9, somewhere in there, in that sort of middle period while there was a co-regency going on, that Jonah is called to go to Nineveh, and the person who is the king of Assyria at that time is Adonirari. Let me find out something else about Adonirari. In 2 Kings 13, verses 3 to 5, it says this: "So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. For a long time he kept them under the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and Ben-Hadad his son. Then Jehoahaziah sought the Lord's favour, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram was oppressing Israel. The Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they escaped from the power of Aram." This deliverer is not named in the Bible. But, and this is where, using F.D. Nichols, one article, I picked this up, was quoting from F.D. Nichols the fact that it is quite likely that this deliverer was Assyria. And therefore, it would be, if we go back to, we haven't got to the timeline yet, but Adonirari, we go back and we see that he was the one at the time that he was sent. Is he that possible deliverer? It is quite likely that he is, because to confirm that at this very time, and this is why this date is set around this period of time, this Bassatheel of Adonirari records his advance against Palestine, the first time the word Palestine is found in historical records outside the Bible. All right? His advance against Palestine and also against Aram. And that's near Lebanon, actually. And what had happened, Israel was being pestered by Aram. This is in the very early days of Jeroboam. And suddenly he is delivered from their pestering at the very time that on this stele there is reference to the fact that the king of Assyria came out and he attacked the people of Aram and brought relief, and Palestine is mentioned. So it's quite likely that this is an explanation as to why there was a bit of a friendship thing going on for exchange for a little while between. And so if we come back to our timeline, is the unknown deliverer that we read about in 2 Kings 13, is it Adonirari, come over from Assyria, delivered the people of Israel from Aram and set them in their freedom? Could well be. Now, one more thing that we find, and it'll bring this to a close, is this. There is also evidence, and it's not just F.D. Nichols who makes this, you'll find it recorded in other places as well. There is also evidence that during the time of the reign of Adonirari III, that there was a religious monotheistic revolution. The only time it appears in the history of the Assyrians. Now, this, let me find if I think I've written it down here somewhere. The monotheistic god that they worshipped was Nabu is his name, a god of the Bosphorus. Now, the interesting thing here, it doesn't say Jehovah God, which if we're seeing this religious monastic revolution that's taking place in the time of this king, if we sort of feel, oh, why didn't he say it was Jehovah? It's because apparently the revival that took place in Nineveh was very short-lived. And it was because all the other gods were thrown aside in favour of this one that the F.D. Nichols and this other author that I was reading, etc., is arguing is probably the influence of Jonah, even though he didn't get them to fully understand who Jehovah was. But they took one of their own gods to repent and serve him. All right? Now, this may not quite fit into all the details as you see it when you look at the story of Jonah. But what it does do, I believe, is as you look at this, it actually helps us realise that, hey, there were some circumstances here that fit the history, particularly by a people when they write their history. They don't write all the good things about the enemy or the other nations, etc. It's only good things about them and their gods. But at least there's an indication here that there was a period of time when they were monotheistic. And could that be the very revival that came as a result from Jonah? Well, that's as far as I want to go with that, people, because for me in the end, when I got to this, at the end of this sort of studying and looking at these different resources that talked about the history before the time of Jonah and Jeroboam and Adad, etc., as I looked at them, I began to realise, wow, there is a history here. There is something going on. They were a cruel people. We see evidence of that. There were palaces. This is one other thing, by the way, I should have mentioned along the way. There were palaces that were built outside the three established capital cities. The capital cities were the administrative centres, a bit like we have Canberra's administrative centre, but our Prime Minister lives in Sydney. And there were other palaces, including Nimrud, which is where in the time of Jonah, Nimrud and the time of Adonai-Ara, that there were palaces built in Nimrud at that time. And so it could well be that there was a king in there at the residential palace temporarily for a period of time. Then he probably moved off to another one. I mean, you look at how many royal palaces the royal family of England has and how they move around amongst them. And so that explained to me the first thing about when it talked about Jonah being, going even to the king at the palace. It wasn't the capital city, but obviously the king during that period did rotate around, and he was obviously there in town at the time of Jonah's arrival. And there are other bits and pieces of that story that fit together. It gave me confidence to feel, yeah, look, I think this does fit in the right time. It is echoing the people of Assyria at that time, even though it was during a relatively weak moment in their long history. It allowed Jonah to get access, and he shared a message that hit a note on monotheism and brought some repentance. Even though the people didn't record it as such, but how long did it last? Not very long. All right, folks, there are some good stories, good points in the story of Jonah. And for me, look, one of the good stories was, to sort of get a confirmation that it does fit into a good context, a good historical context. And to realise that God speaks through people like Jonah to us as well.